I've been getting into power carving a lot lately, which is a great creative outlet, and it allows me to incorporate different techniques into my woodworking, especially since I don't own a lathe. But it can be a very messy process. A lot of people power carve outside, which is fine, but I live in northern New England where woodworking outside is a no-go for a good 4 to 6 months out of the year. So to deal with this, I want to try and build a downdraft workbench for power carving. It will use a downdraft vent attached to my dust collector, as well as an enclosed work area to capture the majority of the wood chips. Success is more about capturing the fine dust created by power carving. The larger wood chips are easy to clean up. But if I can prevent the shop from being covered in a fine layer of dust every time I power carve, I'll be happy. I'm going to build the majority of this workbench out of scrap plywood I have from taking apart some old shop projects. I began by drilling holes for the downdraft vent in what will be the workbench area. I created a tool path in V-carve and let the CNC take care of this task. I made sure the vent holes match the size of standard dog holes so I can use various workbench clamps to hold power carving workpieces in place. And while the CNC worked on that, I pulled wood off the lumber rack for an entirely different project. Then I used the sander to remove some tear out from the router bit as well as some pencil layout marks. But about halfway through sanding, I realized I still needed to mark the locations of the screw holes for the draft hood. Then I fastened the hood to the bottom of the workbench. The shop project I took apart already had pocket holes in it, so I just reused the location of those pocket holes for this project. The bottom panels didn't line up perfectly. I anticipated this might happen since this was all scrap plywood that I didn't cut to size ahead of time. So I ripped it flush with the track saw. I could have avoided this step by measuring the panels before fastening them in place. There's never time to do it right. There is, however, always time to do it twice. Then I put the bottom panel on. The hole served no purpose here. It's just the cutout for a router lift because this is the top of my old router table. Then it was time to install the casters. The spacers are only here because I had 1-inch screws and I didn't want them poking through the bottom panel. I decided to build the enclosure frame out of some poplar I've had lying around for a while. I surfaced the wood off camera and then proceeded to drill a bunch of pocket holes. Then I fastened everything into place. The first couple of vertical framing pieces in the back of the workbench were a bit tricky because I didn't have clamps large enough to hold them in place. So I did my best to hold them by hand and drive the screws into place. Everything was pretty easy after that. After the frame was complete, it was time to install the plexiglass. I chose to use plexiglass to enclose the top of the workbench because I wanted something that would let light in instead of having to install a work light inside of the enclosure. Alternatively, I could have used more plywood or other sheet good to build the enclosure, but then I would have needed some lighting source inside of it. That's totally doable, but in my mind, this approach with plexiglass is easier because it makes use of the lights I already have on in the shop. I got lucky with the side enclosure pieces of plexiglass because I didn't need to cut any of them to size, but I did have to cut the top horizontal piece to size. Cutting plexiglass can be annoying, but if you own a track saw, it does a pretty good job. Just make sure you have a sacrificial piece to lay underneath the plexiglass, and that should be enough to support it to keep it from chipping. In this case, I didn't have the entire piece supported, but luckily it didn't cause a problem for me. With the top piece of plexiglass cut to size, I could now fasten it to the frame. I needed to install an elbow to the dust hood. I'm going to use one of these rubber dust collection unions to do that. These unions are great, but be aware, they're not plumbing unions you buy at the big box home center. These are specifically designed for dust collection. Plumbing unions are a different size diameter, and these dust collection unions are not for plumbing. To get the workbench on the dust collection system, I'm going to use the quick coupler handle that's part of the Dust Right system from Rockler. I've used this before and I like it. I'm doing this alternatively to adding another blast gate to my central dust collection system. I'll probably end up changing this eventually and adding another blast gate with direct dust collection to the power carving workbench, but for now, I need to see if this idea will work before I go through the effort of reducting my dust collection. So, in the meantime, my router table and this workbench will share the same blast gate, and I'll swap back and forth with the quick connect. Now it's time for the moment of truth. The first test will be with the ArborTech TurboPlane cutter. The workpiece is cherry. So this was pretty successful. As you can see, the lack of wood chips around the vent holes means the downdraft is working. The thing you cannot see is the lack of fine dust floating around the air in the shop. This used to be a big problem I had, but the downdraft reduces it significantly. There are some wood chips that made it outside of the enclosure area, but the mess is considerably reduced versus carving on a typical workbench and letting chips fly wherever they want to. The downdraft also makes it really easy to clean up what the enclosure area captures for wood chips and sawdust. Next up, we're going to test the workbench with the Kutzall Extreme Cutter. This creates much finer sawdust versus the ArborTech. The dust around the vent holes shows that the downdraft is definitely working, but there was noticeable dust floating in the air after this test. I don't personally like the Kutzall cutter as much, so if I have to stick with the ArborTech for inside power carving, I can live with that. So there you have it. A workbench that will collect the majority of the wood chips and sawdust created by power carving, at least with certain carving wheels. Now I can continue to power carve during the winter months with minimal mess inside the shop. Thanks for watching.